February 13, 1945. 10:03 p.m. The air above Dresden carries the scent of coal, smoke, and winter cold, mingling with the faint sweetness of Saxony's famous marzipan drifting from the confectionery shops below. Along the Elbe River, baroque spires pierce the darkness like frozen prayers, their silhouettes illuminated by scattered street lamps fighting against the blackout regulations. In the cellars of the Taschenberg Palace, where Wehrmacht officers gather around polished mahogany tables laden with schnapps and cigarettes, laughter echoes off stone walls that have stood for centuries. General Major Klaus von Alfeld raises his glass toward the ceiling, his face flushed with alcohol and contempt. The Americans, he announces to his companions, fly like merchants, in broad daylight, in straight lines, as if delivering groceries. They lack the artistry of war. The other officers chuckle, nodding into their drinks. Above them, the first Pathfinder aircraft from RAF Bomber Command crosses into Saxon airspace, its navigator checking coordinates against a map illuminated by red light. The clock on Dresden's Frauenkirche strikes the quarter hour. In 14 minutes, the laughter will stop forever. For 4 years, German military leadership had watched American strategic bombing with a mixture of professional disdain and genuine puzzlement. The Luftwaffe had been forged in the crucible of blitzkrieg, trained in the philosophy of precise surgical strikes and tactical air superiority. Their bombers dove from the sky, like falcons, their pilots veterans of Spain and Poland who understood air combat as a form of violent ballet. When the Americans entered the air war over Europe, their approach seemed almost comically unsophisticated to German eyes. They flew in massive formations at high altitude, in daylight, vulnerable to fighters and flak. They seemed to care little for elegance or efficiency, instead relying on sheer numerical superiority and industrial output. In the officers' clubs of Berlin, Cologne, and Munich, Luftwaffe generals traded jokes about American bombing doctrine. "They have replaced skill with steel," went one popular quip. "They cannot outfly us, so they simply bring more planes than we have bullets." This contempt was not entirely without foundation. The early American raids had been costly and often ineffective. The first B-17 missions over occupied France in 1942 were tentative affairs, small formations suffering disproportionate losses while causing minimal damage to their targets. German fighter pilots like Adolf Galland and Walter Ossaw found American bomber formations surprisingly easy prey before the introduction of long-range escort fighters. The Americans seemed to approach aerial warfare like they approached everything, with a naive belief that overwhelming resources could substitute for tactical sophistication. German military culture, steeped in the traditions of Clausewitz and Moltke, valued operational art and strategic brilliance. The American approach appeared brutish by comparison, a symptom of a nation that had grown fat on isolation and commercial success, now attempting to play at war without understanding its fundamental nature. But beneath the mockery ran a current of nervous uncertainty that few German officers openly acknowledged. The American industrial capacity was becoming impossible to ignore. In 1943, the United States produced more aircraft in a single year than Germany had manufactured in the entire war to date. American bomber losses that would have crippled the Luftwaffe for months were replaced within weeks. The steady drum of American raids began to take on a different character. Not the sharp, decisive strikes of tactical genius, but the slow, grinding pressure of a millstone, inexorable and pitiless. By early 1944, American bombs were falling on German cities with increasing accuracy and devastating effect. The laughing generals began to notice that their jokes rang hollow in rooms lit by candles because the power stations had been destroyed, that their brandy came in progressively smaller measures as supply lines disintegrated under aerial interdiction. The German military mind had been shaped by the wars of Frederick the Great and the campaigns of 1870, conflicts decided by superior strategy, discipline, and the will of exceptional commanders. They understood war as an art form, a contest of wills between opposing geniuses maneuvering armies like chess masters moving pieces on a board. The American conception of warfare seemed devoid of such sophistication. Americans viewed war as an industrial problem to be solved through superior production, logistics, and the systematic application of overwhelming force. To the German officer corps, this represented not merely a different military doctrine, but a fundamental philosophical divide. The Americans were mechanics, the Germans were artists. The Americans counted tonnage, the Germans studied maps and understood terrain. When German generals watched American bomber streams filling their radar screens, they saw the triumph of quantity over quality, the victory of the mundane over the sublime. In the winter of 1945, as the Reich contracted under pressure from all sides, Dresden stood as a symbol of German cultural achievement relatively untouched by war. The city had been spared the systematic destruction that had befallen Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and dozens of other German urban centers. Its baroque architecture remained largely intact, its museums still housed treasures of European civilization, its streets retained the graceful proportions of 18th century planning. Many Germans believed Dresden would escape the war unscathed, that the Allies would preserve it as a cultural treasure, much as both sides had tacitly agreed to spare Rome and Paris from total destruction. The presence of thousands of refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet armies added to the city's population, swelling it far beyond normal numbers. They came believing Dresden was safe, that its lack of heavy industry and military significance would protect it, that civilized nations waged war against armies, not culture itself. What the German generals failed to comprehend was that the Americans and British had embraced a doctrine of total war that made no such distinctions. The combined bomber offensive aimed not merely at military targets, but at the systematic destruction of Germany's capacity and will to wage war. Every factory worker who could not reach his job, every rail line severed, every night spent in bomb shelters rather than in productive labor, all of this contributed to victory as surely as destroying a panzer division in the field. The Anglo-American bombing campaign represented the industrialization of warfare taken to its logical conclusion. War was no longer a contest between armies, but between entire societies, entire economic systems. The Americans brought to aerial warfare the same ruthless efficiency they had brought to automobile manufacturing and steel production. They built bombers on assembly lines, trained crews with systematic precision, and approached each mission with the detached professionalism of men fulfilling a production quota. On the afternoon of February 13th, General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, commander of Luftwaffe Reich responsible for home air defense, received intelligence reports of massive bomber formations assembling over England. The scale was enormous, more than 800 RAF Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers preparing for a night raid, with an American daylight follow-up mission planned for the next morning. The target remained unclear, but the size suggested a major city. Stumpf's defensive capabilities had been degraded to near impotence. Most of his fighter aircraft had been destroyed or lacked fuel. His radar network was compromised by Allied electronic warfare. His experienced pilots were dead or exhausted, replaced by teenagers with inadequate training. When he studied the plotting board, showing the probable flight path, his aides suggested Dresden as a possible target. Stumpf waved the suggestion away. Dresden has no strategic value, he said, returning to more pressing concerns about the defense of synthetic oil plants and transportation hubs. He was still operating under the assumption that his enemies thought as he did, that they made targeting decisions based on military logic and strategic calculation. The first wave of RAF bombers arrived over Dresden at 10:14 p.m., 13 minutes behind schedule. Pathfinder aircraft dropped brilliant white flares that turned night into artificial noon, illuminating the city's historic center with pitiless clarity. The Elbe River gleamed like molten silver. The distinctive outline of the Altstadt, Dresden's old town, stood out in perfect detail. The bomber crews, flying at 18,000 feet, could see their target with textbook precision. Then came the marker bombs, red and green cascades of fire falling in patterns that designated specific aiming points for the main force following minutes behind. There was no appreciable anti-aircraft fire, no night fighters rising to contest the sky. Dresden's defenses had been stripped away to protect more vital targets. The city lay helpless and exposed, its graceful architecture about to be subjected to a force it was never designed to withstand. The first load of high-explosive bombs struck the Altstadt at 10:21 p.m. 4,000-pound blockbusters and 8,000-pound earthquake bombs designed to crack open buildings and rupture water mains fell in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Roofs shattered, walls collapsed, streets fractured and buckled. Then came the incendiaries, hundreds of thousands of small bomblets designed to ignite fires in the exposed interiors of damaged structures. Thermite, phosphorus, and petroleum gel combinations that burned with savage heat that could not be extinguished with water, that consumed oxygen and generated temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The bombs fell for 24 minutes without pause, a mechanical cascade of destruction delivered with industrial efficiency. The RAF crews followed their orders with professional detachment, checking off targets on their lists, photographing results, calculating drop patterns. Below them, Dresden began to burn. In the cellars beneath the Taschenberg Palace, the laughter had stopped. The first bombs had fallen 3 blocks away, the concussions shaking dust from ancient stones and shattering the schnapps bottles on the mahogany table. General Major von Alfeld stood frozen, his face drained of color, listening to the apocalyptic thunder rolling across the city. He had survived the Eastern Front, had witnessed Stalingrad and Kursk, but this was different. This was not battle but annihilation, delivered from an untouchable height with mechanical precision. He understood, in that moment of terrible clarity, that everything he had believed about American incompetence had been a comfortable delusion. The Americans and British were not poor warriors lacking in skill and artistry. They had simply been playing a different game entirely, one that rendered German tactical brilliance irrelevant. You could not outmaneuver a bombing campaign any more than you could outmaneuver a hurricane. The Americans had industrialized destruction itself, turned warfare into a production process, and Germany was the raw material being processed to extinction. Between the first and second wave, a period of 2 hours and 40 minutes elapsed. This was not an accident or a failure of coordination. It was deliberate timing calculated to maximize casualties and destruction. The interval allowed fire services to emerge from shelter, allowed rescue workers to begin extracting victims from collapsed buildings, allowed survivors to congregate in streets, believing the raid was over. At 1:30 a.m., the second wave arrived, more than 500 Lancaster bombers carrying predominantly incendiary loads. They aimed not at specific targets, but at the spreading fires themselves, using the conflagration as an aiming point to ensure their bombs fell into the heart of the inferno. The fresh incendiaries landed in a city already ablaze, feeding fires that had begun to merge and intensify, adding fuel to a chemical reaction that was developing its own terrible logic. What occurred in Dresden in the early hours of February 14th was a phenomenon that bomber command planners had theorized but rarely achieved, a genuine firestorm. The thousands of individual fires began to merge into a single vast conflagration that generated its own weather system. Superheated air rose with tremendous force, creating a low-pressure zone at ground level. Cold air rushed inward from all directions to fill the vacuum, creating hurricane-force winds that fed the flames with fresh oxygen. Temperatures in the city center exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. Asphalt streets caught fire and burned like coal. Glass melted and flowed like water. Metal beams softened and bent, allowing buildings to collapse inward on themselves. The firestorm created a closed system of annihilation from which there was no escape. Those who remained in cellars suffocated as the flames consumed all available oxygen. Those who fled into the streets were swept by tornado winds into the heart of the fire. At dawn, American B-17 flying fortresses from the 8th Air Force arrived for the scheduled daylight follow-up raid. The crews expected to see the usual gray industrial haze of a German city. Instead, they saw a column of black smoke rising 30,000 feet into the air, visible from more than 100 miles away. As they approached their bombing altitude, they could feel turbulence from the heat still rising from the dying firestorm below. The navigator on a B-17 named Liberty Bell, recorded in his log, could not identify target through smoke. Bombed on Pathfinder instructions. Do not believe anything remains alive down there. The Americans added another 350 tons of high explosive to the ruins, targeting the railroad marshalling yards and any remaining structures on the periphery of the destroyed zone. The mission was executed with characteristic American efficiency. Bombs released on mark, formation maintained, minimal losses sustained. It was professional, competent, and utterly devastating. In Berlin, when reports from Dresden began to arrive, there was initial disbelief at the scale of destruction described. The first estimates suggested thousands of casualties. By midday on February 14th, those estimates had climbed to tens of thousands. By February 15th, it became clear that Dresden had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning city. In the final weeks of the war, as American and Soviet forces converged on the remnants of the Reich, German generals, who had once mocked American military competence, found themselves desperately trying to move their units westward to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. They understood that the Americans, for all their ruthless efficiency in warfare, would at least treat prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions, would provide food and medical care, would offer a path to eventual repatriation. The Soviets, who had experienced the full horror of German occupation, and whose own cities had been subjected to the same total warfare the Luftwaffe had pioneered, were unlikely to be so forgiving. In the irony of their choice lay an acknowledgement. The Americans had proven themselves masters of industrial warfare, but they remained a democracy, bound by laws and conventions even in victory. Dresden's ruins stood throughout the Cold War as a contested symbol. In East Germany, the communist government maintained the destroyed Frauenkirche as a memorial and propaganda tool, evidence of Western barbarism and capitalist warfare. In West Germany, Dresden became a symbol of unnecessary destruction, of the moral ambiguity of Allied bombing campaigns, of suffering that demanded acknowledgement and remembrance. For the Americans and British, Dresden remained controversial, a mission that even architects of the strategic bombing campaign sometimes questioned in retrospect. Churchill, who had enthusiastically endorsed the bombing of German cities throughout the war, distanced himself from Dresden in its aftermath, questioning whether such destruction had been truly necessary. His retreat from his own policies spoke to Dresden's capacity to disturb even those who had ordered it. But in the cold calculus of industrial warfare, Dresden had served its purpose. It had demonstrated that no German city was safe, that the Reich's capacity to resist was being systematically dismantled, that American and British air power could reach anywhere at any time with devastating effect. It contributed to the collapse of German civilian morale, complicated military logistics, and tied down resources in rescue and recovery that might otherwise have been used for military purposes. Whether these strategic gains justified the human cost remained a question without easy answers, a moral complexity that would haunt aerial warfare ethics for generations to come. The transformation in German military thinking after Dresden was profound and permanent. The survivors of the Wehrmacht officer corps who returned from prisoner-of-war camps in the late 1940s brought with them a new understanding of modern warfare. When West Germany rearmed in the 1950s, its new military doctrine showed clear American influence, an emphasis on logistics, industrial capacity, and the integration of air power into combined arms operations. The old Prussian traditions of tactical brilliance and strategic maneuver remained part of German military culture, but they were now understood as insufficient in an age of industrial warfare. The Americans had taught the Germans that in modern war, the ability to produce more tanks mattered more than the ability to maneuver existing tanks more skillfully. 75 years after the Dresden firestorm, archaeologists still uncover bomb shelters filled with human remains fused together by heat into masses that cannot be separated into individual bodies. The physical scars have mostly healed. Dresden was rebuilt, its historic center reconstructed with painstaking care, the Frauenkirche itself rising again from its rubble between 1994 and 2005. But the psychological scars remain embedded in German historical consciousness. Dresden represents the moment when German military leadership confronted the obsolescence of their entire worldview, when the old certainties about warfare and national greatness dissolved in firestorm winds and ash. The ash of Dresden, carried on the wind across Germany and beyond, settled on a continent that would never again view warfare through the romantic lens of tactical genius and strategic brilliance. It settled on a German officer corps that had believed in the supremacy of their military tradition, their tactical skill, their strategic sophistication. It settled on the ruins of a philosophy that had valued elegance over efficiency, artistry over results, the decisive battle over patient attrition. And in settling, that ash wrote a lesson in characters of char and bone, that in the age of industrial warfare, democracy's capacity for production would always triumph over authoritarianism's illusion of superior will. The Americans had not won through tactical sophistication or strategic genius. They had won through factories that ran 3 shifts, through an economy that produced bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down, through the patient application of overwhelming force delivered with mechanical efficiency. The laughter in those Dresden cellars on the evening of February 13, 1945, was the last expression of an obsolete worldview. By dawn, those who survived understood what American bombing doctrine truly represented. Not incompetence, not lack of artistry, but rather the perfection of industrial warfare taken to its logical and terrible conclusion. The Americans had industrialized destruction itself, turned it into a production process, and applied it with the same efficiency they brought to manufacturing automobiles and building skyscrapers. Against such force, tactical brilliance was irrelevant, strategic maneuver meaningless. You could not outmaneuver the systematic destruction of your entire industrial base, could not outthink an enemy whose response to every tactical innovation was simply to bring more resources to bear. Dresden taught that in total war between industrial powers, victory belonged not to the most brilliant generals, but to the most productive factories, not to the most courageous soldiers, but to the most efficient logistic systems, not to the nation with the finest military tradition, but to the society that could sustain industrial production while waging war on a global scale. It was a lesson written in fire and ash, in collapsed baroque architecture and civilian casualties counted in tens of thousands, in the reduction of a cultural treasure to rubble in 14 hours of systematic bombing. The German generals stopped laughing not because they had been proven wrong about American tactical competence, they had been correct that American bombing formations lacked the elegance of Luftwaffe doctrine, but because they finally understood that in modern warfare, elegance was a luxury and efficiency was everything. In the end, Dresden stood as more than a destroyed city. It became a symbol of warfare's evolution into total industrial conflict, of the irrelevance of traditional military virtues in the face of overwhelming material superiority, of democracy's capacity to wage war with the same ruthless efficiency it brought to peacetime production. The ash that covered Dresden in February 1945 carried within it the residue, not just of buildings and bodies, but of an entire philosophy of warfare, reduced to its elements and scattered on the wind. And from that ash would rise a new understanding, that in the 20th century's wars of ideology and production, the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh had proven more decisive than the most brilliant tactical minds of Prussia. The laughter had stopped. The lesson remained.